All right, what's up, everybody? We are back again. Sorry, we're a little late this week. I have been feeling a little sick, so if I'm doing some coughing today, sorry about that. But I figured an episode with me coughing and hacking my way through it's still better than nothing. So hopefully you guys feel the same way because we had to do an episode this week. There has been so much crazy shit going on. We need to start with, of course, the biggest news, and that is the Voting Rights Act getting gutted by the Supreme Court in a 6-3 decision. They said, hey, Section 2, which has allowed people to sue states whose congressional districts resulted in disproportionate racial outcomes to redraw those congressional maps, has now all been overturned. The Supreme Court now says you need to prove a legislature intended to create racial disparities in order to overturn the maps. Not just that the result was racial disparities, but that was the actual intent. So the whole basis of the Voting Rights Act was back in the 60s, they were really worried that southern states would try and disenfranchise black voters by drawing a bunch of congressional districts that would specifically exclude black Americans from being able to elect their own representatives. So what this actually did was force states to create minority majority districts. So if you had a state with an area that had a sizable black population, but not big enough to where they could be the majority in any one single district, you had to create a congressional district for them to be the majority in. And it could be any racial minority. It could be Asians, it could be Jews, it could be Black Americans, it could be anything. Middle Eastern Americans. So it sounded in the beginning like a good idea, and they may have needed it back then. The 60s was a different time, but as America moved forward, it became a more partisan country. And this whole racism thing, again, back to the SPLC's issues, there's a lot more demand for racism in this country now than there is supply. So what Democrats realized they could do is they could sue deep red states like Alabama into creating at least one blue district in each of these states, which are vastly majority Republican. If you had a state like Alabama, let's say, that was voting, I don't have the actual numbers here, but let's say 65% for Trump. Then you had a blue state that was voting 65% for Kamala Harris. The Democrats could go to the courts and say, look, this deep red Alabama state, they have this racial minority here that isn't getting enough representation. So we need to force them to draw a district that will be mostly Black Americans. Democrats obviously will win that district. The same could not be true for the Democratic states. The Republicans couldn't go and sue California and say, hey, you need to make a all-white district or majority white district in LA or San Francisco so that Republicans can have another seat here. It didn't work. White Americans were the only ones that this law didn't apply to. That's why it's a racist law and why it ended up getting gutted, rightfully by the Supreme Court. Because what it turns out is that you shouldn't be drawing congressional districts based on people's skin color. That's usually a bad thing. That's something that Democrats you would think would be accusing Republicans of doing, but of course it's the other way around. It's Democrats that want to draw racial congressional districts, not Republicans. So here we are. All the usual suspects are all furious about this. Gavin Newsom is out here calling this, the next Jim Crow. Chuck Schumer, Ilhan Omar, they all, everyone you would expect is be out here. So what we had before was not just like legal gerrymandering, but you had actually legally mandated, court mandated gerrymandering. You'd see some ridiculous districts, like in Alabama, where like one side of a city, it would be a big pocket of a district, and then you'd just have this like little narrow corridor across the city, then this other big pocket. And you would think, oh, that's gerrymandering for some political partisan purpose. But no, some of those districts were mandated by law to be that way, to connect two parts of town. It could be let's say we're in Michigan here, and there's a Somalian side of town over here and another Somalian side of town over here. You had to draw one district so that they could have their own representative. Completely ridiculous concept that you'd have these stupid districts that are completely gerrymandered and the courts were actually mandating it. But of course, the results are actually much darker than that, as they always are. What this actually contributed to was a lot of racial division. Racial division's gone up in the United States, of course, with the more prevalence of these districts. Because what you have is, and again, let's take Michigan. Instead of an area that may have 3 congressional districts all around the city, all with mixed populations, and they could be swing districts. Instead of having 3 of those where a candidate has to go around to the different populations, meet the needs of all the people, you instead would have, instead of 3 mixed districts here, you would have 1 district of majority Somalians, and then you would have another 2 districts of mostly white Americans. And so then what you would have is this like little mini racial struggle where the Somalian representative is going to go to Congress and he's going to push for things that just benefit the Somalians. Then you have 2 other representatives who are going to go and push for things that are counter to the Somalian community. Because, it turns into this little mini racial struggle in their state. And that's a bad thing. Obviously, we don't want that. It'd be much better to have 3 districts, all with mixed populations that everybody gets to have a say in, and those representatives have to actually represent the mixed populations of their district, not just the one racial group. Because then what happens is now let's jump to Alabama and Louisiana. You may get a district that's mostly black in one state, mostly black in another deep red state. And so these representatives then go to Congress and they form their own caucus, which is like a group of representatives. So you have the Congressional Black Caucus, and their job is to push for policies that benefit Black Americans. That's a bad thing. We don't want caucuses in the Congress just representing a racial group. You should be representing your district, and you should be representing America as a whole. Okay, not just the certain race that's the majority in your district. Everyone would be up in arms if we had a congressional white caucus. Okay, and organized. And I'm not just saying, because people say, oh, well, everyone who in the Congress that isn't a part of these minority caucuses is the white caucus. We've had a white caucus for a long time. That's just the balance of the Congress. Not true. There is no organized group in the Congress that is just sitting there advocating only for the benefit of white people. That's insane. That's what the Black Congressional Caucus does. There is no equivalent like that anywhere else. It's a ridiculous concept, and all it does is contribute to racial division in the United States. It's a bad thing. So then what you got is you have these pockets again where you may have an Asian representative, you may have some Middle Eastern representatives, Rashida Tlaib being a famous one. And so each of these like little mini racial caucuses is all pushing and vying for the benefit of their own racial group in the Congress. And they're completely open about it. They have names. You can go see the Congressional Black Caucus. You can hear them talk about how they're interested in pushing for their racial group to get a bigger share of the pie, etc. And they have their reasons for it that are frankly ridiculous. We shouldn't be doing anything like that, but that's what goes on. So then you get this Congress that is just they justify this racial struggle by saying, well, my district is majority Somalian, my district is majority Asian, so I'm going to push for things that is good for my district, but they're really just interested in what's good for their racial group. So you put all these minority caucuses together, and then what do you get? You get the Democratic Party, of course. The current racial Democrat percentages right here, currently 92% of Black Americans vote Democrat, 70% of Asian Americans, 75% of Jewish Americans, 80% of Americans of Middle Eastern descent, and 75% of Native Americans all vote Democrat. which is weird because, like, what does a Palestinian, an American of Palestinian descent, a Jewish American, and a Native American all have in common? Not much, other than that they typically vote for Democrats. The reason they do so, and then the way the Democrats pitch it to them, is you're an oppressed group. That's what you all have in common. And therefore you're owed some kind of compensation, which is a compelling argument for a lot of people, especially when the economy is bad. Hey, I'm going to give you more free shit. Vote for me. That's one of the oldest tricks in the book. And so this VRA, by creating these majority minority districts and these, one race district majorities. Again, not everybody in this district is one race, but it's majority minority. So what they've done, what the VRA did, was exacerbate these racial tensions. And why would anybody support that? Why, for example, would a politician like Barack Obama, who, when he took office, had record low racial tension in America, want to stoke more racial tension? But if you look at all the polls, in 2016, when Obama left office, race relations were at their worst in a long time. When Obama took office, they were at their highest. Why would that happen? We had a black president. Why would the Democratic Party want to push for more racial division? Well, it creates votes. It's a good short-term strategy and long-term strategy for them because, again, when the VRA was in place, the Voting Rights Act, they could squeeze a blue district out of these red states by saying, hey, this is a minorities versus white people country. You're getting screwed over. You've been historically oppressed, and therefore the government owes you something. So they could, in the short term, they could squeeze out some of these districts. I've heard it's anywhere from 12 to 19 seats in the House Democrats expect to lose now that the VRA has been gutted. There's also a long-term strategy. Again, great replacement, right? Demographics are destiny. The left had no problem saying that before Trump started pointing it out and we all started playing clips of it. It's a declining trend. White people are a decreasing majority in this country, and there are now all the minorities, racial minorities, are trending up as far as a percentage of our population. So if the Democrats can properly position themselves as the party of non-white Americans, they're setting themselves up for the future. The demographics are trending their way, and they can secure their long-term future, their political power. But the VRA being gutted changes all that, because then what's going to happen is these one-race districts are going to be broken up. Everybody's going to have to run in these districts as they should, with multiple racial groups in them, and make the pitch to everybody. Just like democracy is supposed to work. You make the best pitch to as many people as you can, you get voted in. And so there shouldn't be this tension anymore of these districts where you're having one representative going to Congress saying, I just represent Jewish Americans, I just represent Native Americans, I just represent Asian Americans. We shouldn't have that anymore, because if somebody does do that, all the other populations in their district are going to get pretty angry because their interests aren't being represented. Again, this is a good thing for the country. Race relations are going to get better in this country, and that's good for us, because we don't want race relations to be bad. That's not good for us. That is actually really, really bad for us. Probably one of the worst things our country could go through is another dive down into the racial issues that we've experienced in the past. Like the Civil War era and Jim Crow era are the ugliest parts of our country's history, which were all, of course, driven by bad race relations. And thankfully, we've been out of that for a while now, and nobody should want to go back. That's a bad thing. So if the VRA, and these maps are drawn as they should, I think it's going to be good for the country. And Democrats are mad about it. I thought we could go through some of their tweets right now, but I don't really. You know what? Screw it. Why not? Let's see if we can get some of these tweets up. Oh, here we go. Let's do Scott Wiener. Okay. Should be able to see that now. So Scott Wiener says, the Supreme Court just gutted a big piece of what remains of the Voting Rights Act. The VRA is now a shadow of what it was when our government actually wanted people to vote. This comes as California Republicans are pushing a ballot measure that'll make it very hard for many to vote. If you don't have a driver's license or a passport, you'll need to get your birth certificate or social security card. And if you vote by mail, likely require you to write the last 4 digits of your social security or driver's license number on the outside of the return envelope. By the way, California Republicans have no say in how California's run, and this law that California Republicans are going to overturn is one that makes it illegal for you to show voter ID while you're voting, which is absolutely insane. California Democrats love voting fraud, so that's why they have a law like that. There's no other reason to have a law like that unless you love voting fraud. It's completely indefensible. I've never seen anybody stand up and make a good argument for why it should be illegal to request an ID when voting. So an estimate, less than 1% of Californians don't have an ID, because you need an ID to function in today's world. So of course everybody has an ID, but it's the racism of low expectations. They say, well, racial minorities, can't get IDs or something, which is ridiculous because they absolutely can. So Scott Wiener continues on here. We must pass a new federal Voting Rights Act that wipes away right-wing limits on voting, enshrines strong voting protections, and mandates independent redistricting commissions in all 50 states. By the way, California had an independent redistricting commission, and Scott Wiener and his party voted to get rid of it. So, and when he means enshrine strong voting protections, he doesn't mean like voter ID. He means like anybody and their dog is allowed to vote, which actually happened in California. A dog actually did vote and the vote counted, which tells you exactly how strong their security is there. Then he continues, and while we're at it, let's expand the partisan body called the Supreme Court and put term limits on it. Enough. Because, of course, nothing says democracy like expanding the Supreme Court. So this guy's a retard, obviously. He's partisan. He's got a stupid name. Whatever. That's like the least problematic part of Scott Wiener. Yeah, you can see a map here. This is the one I saw, like 12 seats are expected to go out. So you can see these deep red states had these blue districts, and you just don't see that. You don't see a lot of, red districts in the middle of these sparsely populated blue states because courts wouldn't mandate that they had to exist. So recap, VRA gone. Good thing. Not completely gone. Section 2 is good. So that's what we wanted. Let's move on though, because there's more good news. The United Arab Emirates is leaving OPEC. I think that's tomorrow. Let me take a look here. As of May 1st, which when you guys actually, this is released to you, it'll be today. The UAE is leaving OPEC. So what the hell is the UAE? What the hell is OPEC? That's a lot of acronyms. The United Arab Emirates, a small but rich country in the Middle East, that's where Dubai is, has been a part of, for 59 years, they've been a part of OPEC, which is an international oil cartel. It stands for the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries. So these Middle Eastern countries, I think it was like Iran, Iraq, it wasn't the UAE to begin with, it was Venezuela, and a couple other countries 60-ish years ago, said, hey, we produce all this oil and we're in competition with each other. And the more we pump out of the ground altogether and put onto the market, the lower prices fall. And then we just can't make any money because we're all competing for market share. And it's not working for us. So we have this idea. Let's all get together. Let's all agree to only pump, let's say, half of our current capacity out of the ground every day. And then what'll happen is that restricts supply. And so then price is going to increase because, again, restrict supply, demand. You cut one of those down. If you don't have enough supply, prices are going to increase. You have too much demand, prices are going to increase. Okay, so demand stays the same, supply is cut, price has to rise. So They say, yeah, this is a great idea. And then a few years later, other countries started joining. The UAE was one of them, joined later. Russia ends up joining a lot later. Saudi Arabia is, I think, one of the biggest members of of OPEC. So the United States has always had this complicated relationship with OPEC because we've been in and out of alliances with these countries over the decades OPEC has existed. Saudi Arabia, being one of our chief allies in the Middle East now, has always been a part of OPEC, and same with the UAE, not always part of OPEC, but they're one of our allies. They're there. So the US could go in and say no, and Europe could say no, we're not going to buy oil from you guys, but then prices would increase. We don't really have the wherewithal economically to really take it to these OPEC countries and break up this cartel. And so American oil companies have never felt the need to push the government to go after it because they tacitly endorse OPEC. They benefit from OPEC because the United States is not a part of OPEC, but since the Middle Eastern countries are cutting their supply down, American oil companies can produce as much as they want, and they benefit from the prices being artificially pushed up by OPEC cutting their supply. So countries that are not a part of OPEC, their oil companies benefit at the expense of the OPEC countries. That's a part of the struggle of forming a cartel, is all the people operating outside the cartel actually make more money. That's why it's hard to keep people in it. So then what happens is the UAE obviously has been getting bombed by Iran. Iran's also a part of OPEC, and the UAE says, you know what, enough of this. Russia's supporting Iran. They're a part of OPEC. Iran's bombing us. We want nothing to do with this. We need to raise money for the repairs because our cities are getting bombed. So we're going to leave OPEC. So now what the UAE is going to do is they're going to raise how much they're producing in oil prices, and because prices are high right now. So if the UAE can produce a lot more oil, these high prices, they can make a lot of money. Now the prices are going to come down a little bit when UAE puts more oil on the market, again, because that supply is going to rise, so prices are going to fall. Then all that does is put more pressure on the OPEC countries to leave. Iraq is the next one that we're hearing may want to leave the cartel. So the more countries that leave the cartel, the weaker the cartel gets. The more countries that leave the cartel, so that cartel gets smaller in market share, the more they have to cut their supply in order to artificially hold prices up. And so the cartel, it gets harder and harder to maintain the cartel the more people leave. And again, when you're in the cartel, you're artificially putting prices up, but then countries like the United States and the UAE are cashing in, making all the money because they get to produce as much as they want at the prices that are higher. So also a big hit is Venezuela is now essentially a puppet state of the United States. So we now have access to their oil to use for our domestic purposes that we'll purchase at prices that seem to be determined by Donald Trump. I don't really know how that's working on the inside, but we have power over them that OPEC doesn't. So with the UAE leaving, huge blow to them. And then, by the way, if OPEC breaks up and shatters into a million pieces, that's great for us. It's terrible for our enemies. It's bad for Iran. It's bad for Russia. It's bad for Saudi Arabia, who's an ally. But it's good for us because as consumers of oil, because if they stop holding these oil prices artificially high, the prices will come down. Everybody's got to compete again. So they're pulling as much oil as they can out of the ground, and prices do this. And then our gas prices go down. Prices of anything that include oil are going to go down. That's good for the consumer. When OPEC was at its strongest, constricting supply, keeping prices up, the big losers are the United States citizens, because even though our oil companies are benefiting a lot from the high prices, we're still getting screwed because the oil companies can sell the oil at that artificially high price, And then we got to pay more for gas while the oil companies make money hand over fist. So cartels are a bad thing. International cartels are bad, but they never last forever because it's hard to get people to stay in them. There's always an incentive to cheat, always an incentive to leave the cartel. So that's why that's not the natural state of the market. And over these decades and decades, these cartels all do eventually dissolve, even if it does take a long time. So rare episode these days, full of good news. So I don't have anything bad for you guys. A little bit later, I think we'll drop an episode. We'll dunk on Mark Levin. And then Fauci's aide was indicted. We'll cover that next episode too. So again, rare good news for everybody. I thought we'd give you a good break from the Iran war. Talk about some good stuff. Everybody can go into this weekend nice and happy. Have a good one, guys.